that if you look at the private sector data, it has been most probably less than 1% of what it is right now. And because of that private sector, it's really a testimony of the impact that the institute has had on providing accountants, providing managers, providing CEOs, providing thought leaders in the private sector. Unfortunately, when you look at Zimbabwe, involvement of actors in the public sector is very minimal. If you look at the number of CAs or ICAZ members that are in the public sector, the last count of the institute was actually about 5, at most 10. So we have to reflect the impact that we are taking into the public sector if we remain as spectators of what's happening in the public sector. So our involvement basically is to make sure that we get involved as an institute to improve transparency, corporate governance, and accountability within the public sector. And how was the intervention? We're looking at setting up a professional public sector accountant, who is basically the sector public sector. To be a specialist qualification, and it will cover both audit and also cover technicians, people who actually do bookkeeping things in the public sector. And the capacity that we build in the public sector will be bolstered by continuous professional education for public sector professionals. How is it going to be done? ICAZ is going to develop public sector professional qualification, and this public sector professional will be able to work in government, both local and national government, including state-owned enterprises. We'll be working together with the Auditor General and Accountant General to make sure that whatever costs we come up with is relevant to Zimbabwe. We are also looking at having pathways for chartered accountants who also want to be public sector professionals, and also for public sector professionals who want to be chartered accountants. So we are going to have 2 separate streams of trainings. The qualification that we are going to have is going to be world class. We are looking at a qualification that's going to be acceptable at a global stage by all the major public sector accounting bodies in the world. This to others. I think there's a section that I say who participate in the rebuilding of Zimbabwe to improve corporate governance and accountability within government, and then also increase our participation in terms of influencing government policy, because we are providing a service that we believe is required within government. Where are we going now? Has been selected by IPAC, which is the International Financial Accounting Body, and also DFID to pilot this professionalization of the public sector. We are going to be developing the curriculum, course studies including exam structures. In conjunction with PAB, we've provided the committee's framework. We'll be reporting to you members on a quarterly basis in the Chartered Accountant magazine on the progress on this project. And I'm appealing to all members to participate fully in this project. Like I said, we need to make the same impact that we've made in the private sector over the past 100 years. We need to make the same impact into the public sector over the next 100 years. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We still have 25 minutes. Any questions? We'll take a few questions. There's a question over there. about that. I just want to find out how one can participate.
Okay, I think we got the public sector task force. I think I would suggest you get hold of the secretariat and then you put your name to participate as a member of the committee, so that at least we can get to interact with you on that. Yeah.
Do you really think he will be around in the next 20 years? I don't see that happening.
You mean
I might expand. Most of your work has been taken over by the computer. It's a reality. And if you take the public sector, CIS has taken over. That space is occupied. Look at the most public people who are now doing accounting for the public sector in Zimbabwe, CIS. Then there's ACA, there's CIMA, and for basically a declining market, overloaded.
I think it's a fair, but we believe that the brand that we are bringing onto the table and the courses and the qualification that we are actually developing will make significant headway. And we believe that the same structure and strategy that we've used for the private sector, if we cut and paste it for the public sector, obviously we have to tailor-make it for the public sector. I think we'll make significant impact, and we believe that we've got a lot more to offer than the other professional bodies. So if you ask me, yes, I'm confident we should be able to make inroads into that. Yeah.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much, sir. Your gift is on the way. We'll find it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm sure that you've actually noticed that in front of you is auditors. There's the black boxes. This is, if you open it, this is a key holder from ICAZ Winter Limited. So please could you give them a round of applause? It's actually yours. This is yours. ICAZ Winter. Our next session is on corruption and business ethics. It will be presented by Professor Patrick Lumumba. Just a brief biography. He is an associate professor of public law, founding dean, Kabarak University School of Law, and an advocate of the High Courts of Kenya and Tanzania. He is a former director and chief executive officer of the Kenya School of Law. He is the founding trustee of the African Institute for Leaders and Leadership and founding chairman of the Association of the Citizens Against Corruption. He is a former lecturer at the University of Nairobi, United States International University in Africa, Widener University, USA. He is also a former secretary of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission and former director of the defunct Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, now Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. He holds Bachelor of Laws and Master of Laws degree from the University of Nairobi, on the Law of the Sea from the University of Ghent, Belgium. He is also a holder of the degree of Doctor of Letters from the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. Fellow of the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya, a member of the Kenya Institute of Management and a certified mediator. Currently, Professor Lumumba is actively involved in running his foundation, law firm, and Pan-Africa activities. Please help me welcome Professor Lumumba.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts on a subject that is truly evergreen. I've prepared my presentation, which I believe will be circulated to the members later in the day. Let me preface my presentation with a number of stories, if only to give practical flavor to the presentation. One of which I've drawn from the good professor who spoke before me, and is, in my view, relevant to the entire discourse about corruption, a subject that this continent has and continues to talk about. And he made a distinction which I thought was very relevant and one that we ought to take cognizance of, whether we are in the private sector or in the public sector. That is leadership accountability. Africa is a continent that has no shortage of laws. For everything we have laws. The only thing that we don't tend to do well is to follow those laws. In fact, we labor from the unfortunate belief that when we enact laws, we have solved the problem. And that is a tragedy which we ought to address. And I believe that that dichotomy is necessary because there is no wisdom, no merit in enacting laws that we do not intend to follow. The second thing that I want to talk about is what I call the social morals of any country whatsoever. The African state as we know it is largely artificial. We have states struggling to be nations, states with many nationalities, with different cultures. There is a little book that I have written and which I commend to all of us, written by 4 authors who are familiar with the dynamics of African economics and African politics. Greg Mills, whom you know, is from South Africa, advised the government of Rwanda for a long time. President Olusegun Obasanjo, formerly of Nigeria. Jeffrey Herbst, who has written quite a bit about Africa, and Dickie Dennis, all of whom are thinkers about Africa and have written a book titled Making Africa Work. And you will be surprised that on the cover of that book, the former Malawian President Joyce Banda says, "I wish I had this book before I became the president." Whether that is to be commended or not is another debate. But if there is any value in that statement, it begins to suggest to us that these 4 individuals have identified such which in their view, which is born out of experience, Africans ought to engage in if we are to realize our potential. The third thing that I want to preface my presentation with is a story that was told to me by an Indian friend. Whether it was apocryphal or not, I do not know, but it helps to make my case. He said, in his village, there was a man who had a dairy farm. And in order to run his dairy farm, he had a list of individuals who served him in different capacities, including to measure the milk, including to collect the money, including to milk the cows, and all the things that happen in places where people are generally dishonest. He went on what was a benchmarking trip Whether it's true or not, I do not know. It could possibly be helping to make this case. But he says that he went to a village in the Netherlands, and he was surprised in a village where they were doing exactly the same thing that he was doing. That there was a farmer, and this farmer had only one employee. And what he did after milking his cow, he would place the milk somewhere, and he had a measurement cup. And people would come and place the right amount of money and take sufficient milk. In his case, he said it could not happen. Because what would happen, he said, people would come and take the milk and not leave the money. The farmer himself would add water to the milk. And his story was that dishonesty creates positions which are completely unnecessary. And those of you who are in government or those of you who are outside of government will be amazed at the number of sinecure positions that are created in African countries. There is something that is happening now in South Sudan, and I wish them well in an attempt to regain peace. They have now created or proposed a government where there will be a president, there will be a vice president, and 4 vice presidents, and 35 ministers, and 552 members of parliament. Those are the things that happen in our part of the world, which defy both reason and logic. And that environment that I'm now being asked to speak about corruption and the business environment, it is a very easy task, because it's something that we live with on a daily basis. And when one therefore is asked to make a presentation of that nature, one does not need to define what corruption is. It's like the proverbial elephant. Those of you who steal from the government, call it taking. Those of you who steal from the private sector, say it is sharp behavior. Those of you who are engaged in some manner have a description for it. But the net effect is that corruption is deadly. And I think that Kofi Annan, when he was the Secretary General of the United Nations, got it right. He says that corruption is worse than prostitution. But while prostitution corrupts the individuals of only few, corruption is cancerous and destroys the entire society in all its permutations. And many have talked about corruption. I was reading something about an individual in the 4th century BC in India who was justifying corruption. He says that corruption and prostitution are possibly some of the oldest vices that humanity has ever known. And he was caught just in the court of the king, and he said that it's impossible for a person to work in the private sector and not to steal, just as it is impossible to have honey on the tip of your tongue and not to lick it. Those are the justifications. It is equally impossible for a fish to swim in water and not to have some water enter in its mouth. They say, close your mouth. That is easier said than done. So that is what corruption is. And corruption has been defined, but I think there are popular definitions, and one can say that is the use of public office for private benefit in the private sector. One can say that is abuse of office for personal benefit. The net effect of this is that you reap where you did not sow, to put it crudely. And perhaps one can say that corruption is the word that white-collar thieves use to describe their theft. Otherwise, it is just theft on an industrial scale. That is what corruption is. And it is seen and visible in different sectors of the society, particularly in the business arena. We have received and had presentations this morning about how government ought to intervene in various sectors. But let us ask ourselves, what is business? And before we ask that secondary question, we ask the foundational question: why are government instituted amongst men? And very reluctantly, I've always loved this thing to be found in the American Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that it is for this reason that governments are instituted amongst men, that they may midwife, not their words but my words now, that they may midwife this process, and that if they fail in this process, it's the legitimate right of the people to remove them from government. If therefore our agenda in life is to pursue happiness, and that government are instituted to mediate and to midwife this, what should governments do? Governments are then put in place in what we describe as democracy. And I no longer accept the definition that democracy as conceived by the conceptual West is what democracy is. The conceptual West told us, and we believe, like we are in the business of believing in this part of the world, that in order to be democratic, you must have multi-party state. That is what they say. Number two, that in order to be democratic, we must have periodic elections. That in order to be democratic in the post-Westphalian state, we must have the rule of law. That we must have a government that has an executive and a legislature and a judiciary. That is what we were told. And we don't believe it, but we practice it because we were told. So the Africans now, every other African country tries to hold these elections. But we know that African governments have also succeeded in the art of rigging these elections. So that the results are always, as the good professor said, predetermined. But yet we are able to tick the boxes. What are the boxes? We have multi-party. The box number one tick. We have periodic elections ticked. We have a parliament ticked. So we are in the business of ticking the boxes. So how do you tick these boxes? The question is, do those governments then deliver to us the thing that we want government to deliver? Do they deliver on security? Do they deliver on the critical things that improve the quality of our life? Whether it is education, whether it's health, whether it's agriculture, in all those areas, do they deliver? The answer is they don't. 80% of the times they don't. And why don't they deliver? We have identified that one of the reasons why they don't deliver is corruption. And if you look at many African states, you will discover, therefore, that even before they attained flag independence, as most African countries have, we had laws that governed or dealt with corruption. In those days, we talk about bribery. The giver and the taker are both guilty of a crime called bribery. Over time, we discovered that the African state was being depleted. And it was being depleted because the men and women, particularly the men who are entrusted with political power, were using their offices for purposes of acquisition of material wealth to the detriment of the people. So that it was both ironical and paradoxical at once that African countries had the richest presidents or richest leaders presiding over the poorest countries. If you doubt me, just look at the case of Mobutu Sese Seko of the Democratic Republic of Congo, then called Zaire, which was rightly called a kleptocratic regime. Or look at the case of Jean Bedel Bokassa in Central African Republic, and many other leaders that we can count. Look at Equatorial Guinea, or in the neighborhood here in Angola. And what one discovers is that one of the quickest ways to material wealth then became the occupation of public office. The international community then took the view that this was such a pernicious crime that it ought to be dealt with at the international level. And once again, many of us will know that in Merida, Mexico, in the year 2003, we then came up with the UN Convention Against Corruption. Once again, we were quick at signing. In fact, my country, Kenya, was the first country in the world to sign and ratify a treaty. The minister representing the Kenyan government saying, not in so many words, but to this effect, that the issue of dealing with corruption in my country is so urgent that we must sign and ratify now so that it becomes effective immediately. And we went on this signing spree
But immediately after that, we also did something that our continent is very good at writing, giving longer names to international instruments. We came up with our own, the African Charter on Prevention and Combating Corruption. But we never intended to prevent nor to combat corruption. We were in the business of ticking yet another box. And if you therefore look, and then it was cascaded to our own domestic laws, so that if you look at different countries now, each one of us have elaborate institutions and elaborate pieces of legislation that deal with it. In the SADC region, you have your own protocol. In ECOWAS, they have their own protocol. In East African Community, we have our own protocol. I think something is cooking up in COMESA, in ICAZ, in Sahel, in the Maghreb. Once again, a forest of treaties, conventions, and laws, and other practices which have become the norm in many organizations. I believe it happens here in Zimbabwe or in Zambia. You now have these things called performance contracting. And is some kind of annual jamboree at which public officials meet to sign certain things, saying that these are the things that we intend to achieve, but they never achieve them. But they sign them as an annual ritual every year to humor themselves. And all these things are put in place in order to ensure that you have a legal regime. We even have anti-corruption authorities. At one time, somebody, and only recently actually, somebody who was disgusted with the levels of corruption in Africa said, we should disband all these organizations. I told them that is not the organization that are problematic. What you are suggesting, for example, therefore I said, that you are suggesting because sin is still alive and well, we should disband Christianity and Islam and all these religions. And I told him that when you are dealing with corruption, this is a vice that must be spoken about and against on a daily basis because it has become a part of business. So the basic position as it is now is that Africa and African countries have no shortage of laws. The laws are innocent. It is not for want of laws that corruption thrives. It is for want of something else. What is it? Could it be institutions? Perhaps. Let us, in this presentation, ask ourselves whether we do not have institutions and whether those institutions are designed to work. You know, Africa presents very differently. When many people talk about Africa, they talk about Africa as if it was a homogeneous whole, that there is something called Africa. They never quite imagine that we have 55 countries. That is if Morocco agrees that Sahrawi is the 55th, which they don't often. But we have 55 odd countries. The Democratic Republic of Congo only has over 233 nationalities. Tanzania, over 136 nationalities. Nigeria, over 200. And all these come from a tradition which has a different worldview. And these countries, as you know, were colonized, and one need not go into the history of the colonization. But we inherited a set of laws. If you are colonized by the English, a set of laws. If you are colonized by the French, a different set of laws. If you are colonized by the Portuguese, a different set of laws. If you are colonized by the Spaniards like Equatorial Guinea, a different set of laws. If you are under trans-territoryship of South Africa, you are a different set of laws. That is the Africa that we are trying to weld together, so that we have communities within our societies or individuals within our societies who, despite, or is it in spite of the intervention of formal education, have not quite left their tribal practices. And when you tell them that there is theft, they wonder what you are talking about. There are communities where taking something that does not belong to a specific person does not constitute theft. And in those communities, they actually say that corruption is a victimless crime. It has no victims. A cabinet minister who has ordered an item which is worth $1 million and priced it for $2 million does not see what he or she has stolen. Says, who is the victim here? I simply took $2 million and my village is very happy with me. They say, actually, I'm their most successful son. And if you accuse that individual of being a thief, they say, well, yes, we know he's a thief, but he's our thief. And you know, this is not idle. There was a time when a mayor of a particular African country, which I'll not name, was jailed in the United States of America. And when he arrived in his country, they were praise singers saying that while others steal in shillings, he steals in dollars. That is the environment in which we are talking about. And I'm saying this before I talk about the institutions. Do institutions in Africa work? Are they designed to work? And we have seen in quite a number of countries that organizations and institutions are created, anti-corruption authorities. But the unspoken instruction to those who head those institutions don't work, appear to do something, but don't do anything that threatens us. And they only appear to function when they are dealing with petty thieves. Once they begin to go into the arena where you actually find the thieves, it's like trying to do a footpath in an equatorial forest. As you enter the forest, you meet rats. When you kill the rats, nobody quite complains. As you enter the forest a little deeper, you begin to meet antelopes and duikers. Nobody complains. But as you get deeper and you meet the rhino and you meet the elephant, then the lions begin to roar. You are now beginning to get into our arena. And so it is with corruption. When you are arresting a little officer who has stolen a few things, nobody worries about you. When you are arresting a police officer on the beat who has received a bribe and counting their teeth in addition to other things, nobody talks about you. But immediately you touch a cabinet minister, then people begin to say that our tribe is being finished. So how do you reconcile in an African setting that we create institutions which are like other institutions in the world, but they don't function with the same kind of efficiency as they do in other countries? It is because those institutions are footloose. They rest on a very weak foundation, and that they are not designed to work. And that is why I was saying at the very beginning that the problem of Africa is not the problem of absence of laws or the problem of absence of institution. It is the absence of governance and the will of those in political leadership to do things that are in the best interest of their country. A few weeks ago, I had a privilege of speaking at a forum, and when I was asked, are there leaders in Africa? I said very quickly, there are no leaders in Africa. There is a shortage of them. If they are few, they are far between. There are only dealers in Africa. And these dealers are the ones to whom we have entrusted leadership. And when we expect them to provide leadership, we are deluding ourselves because they can't. It is like telling a goat that when you grow up, you'll become a cow. It will not become a cow. So we give them time. We tell them that you will grow into the thing. They can't grow into the thing. They are stunted because they are goats, and we expect them to become cows. The net effect, therefore, is that they affect the entire arrangement and the entire established, including business, which is the subject of my discussion today. Because the business environment and the businessman thrives in an environment where there is governance. The good professor spoke, and I agree with him, that one of the things that you must have is clarity of vision. He or she who has no vision can never get lost, because they don't know where they are going. So wherever they are at their destination. And that is the problem of the typical African. They have no vision, therefore they can never get lost. Wherever they are, that is where they are going. But if you ask countries where people have a vision, they know that they, from 100 years from today, and about a month or two ago, I looked and listened very keenly to the meeting of the Chinese leaders, the parties, the 5,000 of them who are meeting in Beijing. They are thinking of how they are going to deal with Africa in 100 years' time. None of them will be alive by that time. But they are thinking because that they know that leadership is intergenerational. Leadership is a marathon relay race. It may be a contradiction in terms. So that when I looked at those men, I say, here are statesmen thinking of the next generation. Your typical African leader is a politician, and a politician only thinks of the next election. And the net effect, therefore, is that they have what was aptly described here as instant coffee microwave mentality. They want things to ripen quickly. They want trees to be planted today, and they, by dint of some political and economic abracadabra, they become mature trees immediately. They can't. History has demonstrated times without number. And I'm submitting to us, therefore, that corruption does affect business in many ways. First of all, simply that the environment is hostile. We have had presentations here where we have been told about the macroeconomic policy. You know, Africa continues to amaze and amuse at once. There used to be an African president in Uganda, Idi Amin. He was told there was no money. And he asked a question which from his standpoint was very logical. Have you run out of paper? Have you run out of ink? Are the printing presses no longer functional? He was told all those are functional. But there are certain fundamentals. He says those fundamentals are the ones that hold us back. Print money. And behold, they printed papers which they thought there was money. There is logic to money. There is logic to it. There is economic logic to it. There is scientific logic to it. But if you have individuals who cannot see that logic, then they undermine that logic. And the net effect is that that can be characterized as corruption. I want to break corruption to demystify this thing, corruption. The net effect, as somebody said here during the presentation on retirement, that you can have $1 billion United States dollars in your account sitting pretty in the bank, but if the economic fundamentals of your domestic arena are eroded, that 1 million can become useless overnight. And we have seen that happen in quite a number of African countries. And these are the kind of things that one is talking about. But permit me also to talk about the accountants, the professionals. Because for every corrupt deal, invariably 9 out of every 10 corruption deal, there is a presiding professional. That presiding professional is an accountant, is a lawyer, is an engineer, and what they do is to sanitize the process. Let me start with you accountants. What you do is an annual ritual every year. And this ritual is couched in very professional terms. That you have sampled, not in so many words, you go into institutions and sample certain things. Then when you make your report, you begin with a caveat. That this report is not from us. It is from the document that have been supplied to us. And at the end of the day, you say that it is done in accordance with international accounting standards. Then you put your hand. Then you recommend certain things. Of course, that is the best you can do because you are not there on a daily basis. But there are situations where you are actually called upon by individuals who are presiding over corrupt institutions to doctor those accounts. We have seen it. Whether it's true or not, we do not know. But the situation of KPMG in South Africa with the Guptas is one that we now mention. We can mention in the United States, if you permit me to go outside of the continent, Madoff and his retirement benefit. And go to the cash gate in Malawi. We can go to Zambia. There are many things that happen, and we are presiding over them. The question is, are we professionals without blemish? Do we use the mask of our professionalism to mask what is essentially theft by another name? It is in a forum such as this that we must ask ourselves those painful and difficult questions. Lawyers, how many times under the guise of having the sanctity of the client's account do you create false and fictitious files where is buying a non-existent property from a non-existent client for purposes of cleaning up $1 million that has been obtained from illegal wealth from Colombia in South America or some other country? And one can go on and on in the business environment. Those of you who are involved in retail, how many of you run parallel receipting systems, one for the taxman and one for you, the real things? So when one looks at corruption, one must say that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory, both of man here and of God. All of us. Which then begs the question, because the anecdotes are known to you, as I said at the beginning, talking about corruption is like preaching the gospel. The Quran has its own things about saying how bad it is. We go to the mosques on Friday and say all manner of things, but immediately we get out of there, we begin on our default mode, which is the thieving mode. And the same thing to Christians and all others. Corruption is deadly because its impact is instant. And we can give anecdote after anecdote, example after example, but what is it that other civilizations have done that have made it the exception other than the rule? And this brings me to the second level of my presentation. Having discovered, if you allow me to recap, having recognized that corruption is the use of public office or private office for personal benefit, having recognized that the impact of corruption has been recognized the world over, having recognized that the world then has an international treaty that characterizes corruption in that regard, having recognized at a continental level that we need to deal with corruption effectively and coming up with a convention, having recognized at a national level that we need pieces of legislation that deal with this, having recognized in our various institutions that we need guidelines that reduce corruption, what then is it that we must do, having also recognized that institutions in and of themselves are not an immunizing factor? What is it that we must do in order to ensure that corruption is reduced to levels where its impact is minimal? And that we can only learn from other countries and other civilizations that have dealt with corruption effectively. Permit me to cite countries that are never mentioned by way of example. Norway, which all of us know, is a little country with a population of no more than 10 million. That country, as we speak now, has a sovereign fund of $1 trillion United States dollars. So that notionally, if you are to divide that money to the Norwegians, each Norwegian would receive about 190,000 United States dollars. And if you are to go further, you would discover that even children who have yet to be born, when they are born, would possibly receive something. And even those who are born a little later in 50 years' time. Let us come to Zimbabwe. Which is Africa in microcosm. I could mention Malawi, I could mention any other country, but I'm in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, your great-grandchild, for those who are unmarried, I'm speaking to those who are unmarried, your great-great-grandchild, when they will be born, they will inherit a debt which this generation has consumed. Why? It is because we have allowed our institutions not to function. One can say, but that is true of every other African country, but we are told it has nothing to do with the color of our skin. Because in Botswana, they are doing it differently. Because in Rwanda, they are doing it differently. So the fault is with us. The fault is with the individuals that we have allowed to preside over our institution. You know, and I hope that my flight is confirmed, so that I leave this evening. Because at one time, I said that I wish I was invited to a meeting where there were central bankers, and I would have asked the governor of Central Bank of Zimbabwe, now that you are a central banker in Zimbabwe and you have no currency, what do you preside over in real terms? And I'm saying this as I am going to the other level, is that in order to ensure that we deal with the subject of corruption, there are a number of things that must be done going forward. Number one, we must have a culture of obeying the laws and a culture where impunity does not exist. And this is what we were told, leadership accountability. When the leadership is when individuals are punished for their transgression, then the message is sent that people will be punished. You know, Africa loves this thing called civic education. In my view, if you jail 2 cabinet ministers, that is more than civic education for 2 years. And you don't only jail them, you seize their property. So we must, in the nature of things, eliminate impunity. Number 2, we must have a national mores. We must morally rearm as a people. And moral rearmament requires, among other things, that we must have a tradition of following the law. Number 3, we must put into office men and women with integrity. Easier said than done. But it has been demonstrated that when leaders are good, people tend to follow what they do. Those of you who are in positions of leadership, and many of you, indeed all of you are here, when you are known to arrive in your office at 5, you don't need to tell anybody to come early. They will all come early, even when the official reporting time is 8. Number 4, we must have a culture of transparency in the manner in which we run our institutions. And transparency means that we are able to deal with procurement issues in a transparent manner. In many African countries, we have these laws called procurement. But procurement, in many ways, is theft in accordance with the law. If you allow paperwork to be the only driving factor, they will always manufacture paperwork, but at the end of it, you don't get value for your money. One can go on and on, but I've been told to summarize, and this is the manner in which I want to summarize. Number 1, that corruption is pernicious, that corruption undermines the law. Corruption is a danger to democracy and governance. Number 2, that corruption affects all sectors of the economy, whether it's in agriculture, whether it is in education, whether it is in health. It affects every sector of the economy. Number 3, that corruption undermines the morality of a country and destroys the current and as well as the future. That corruption can be fought in a number of ways. That having a raft of legislations is only the foundational space, but we must have a culture of obeying all those laws. Number 4, that corruption must be, the fight against corruption must be predicated upon institutions, not messianic leaders. This idea that we have messiahs who will come and remove corruption is only sustainable as long as that messiah is alive. But history has demonstrated that institutions are the ones that have a long-time impact in the fight against corruption. Number 6, that corruption, the fight against corruption must be cascaded so that it becomes the natural default instinct, which means, among other things, that we must even start in our institutions. And lastly, that those who engage in corruption must be punished. And if they are not punished, we will have and reap the fruits and indeed the bitter fruits of the impact of corruption. In a nutshell, therefore, business will only thrive in an environment where merit is the watchword. Business will only thrive in an environment where there is integrity at the political level. Business will only thrive in an environment where there is what I call hygiene in the conduct of our political affairs. And if there is that hygiene, then the net effect is that the country will thrive, and that country will be a country that has a pride of place amongst the Committee of Nations. Thank you very much. The full flavor of my paper will be found in consuming that paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lumumba. We'd like to open the floor for questions. Can you see the hands for questions? There's already a hand there.
Thank you, Professor. A truly inspiring presentation. I just wanted to ask, in your view, one of the things we tend to look at is to say, well, the problem is at the top. We've got a corrupt government. Which way should it work? Do we say strong institutions can influence or change things at the top, or we need to have a good top in order to have good institutions at the lower level, at micro level? Which way does it work? They say that if a fish is rotten at the bottom, it means the head is gone completely. So which is your view on that?
Without being prescriptive, there are several models, but I have a model that I favor the most. In Nigeria, when there was a coup d'etat and the leader who came in was Murtala Mohammed, he had a reputation for doing things the right way. And during the short period that he was there, the quality of driving improved. Everything improved because they said, with Murtala, we are not joking. Which suggests to me that people know what is right. It is the environment that enables them or allows them to do what is wrong. Because that which is wrong has quick advantages. There is another method which is longer and more painful, which when change comes from the bottom. We saw that in Tahrir Square. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, I was in Rwanda and a young man told me, he said, you go tell leaders whenever you find them that unless they solve the problems of the young people in a few years, we will be the problem. And I thought that was very insightful. So my view is, and history has demonstrated, that when leadership is enlightened, that when leadership is focused, then there is the tendency that action from the top corrects the situation quickly. And that has been demonstrated in a number of countries. Look at Botswana. Look at Rwanda. Look at Tanzania within a very short time. But when leadership says what it does not do, then the people know, oh no, that is just another thing. He says it for public consumption. So my view, let us correct the leadership. The leadership will then use the institution to do the right thing. As I conclude answering your question, let me give you an example. Have you ever gone, there was a time I went to the United States, my first time in the United States of America, and I was, like all of us when you visit for the first time, on a shoestring budget. So they strategically placed us next to a McDonald's. And we went there, and once you've been served, typically in an African restaurant, once you've eaten, you walk away. Some lady politely told me, no, that is not what we do here. Take your tray and take it to the trash can. After 2 days, that is what I was doing. I was crossing the road. Normally, when there is a zebra crossing, I crossed and I obeyed the traffic lights. But when I went home, after a few weeks, I went back to my default mode. When I'm crossing the road, I now run. Because I know that the driver, so it tells me that the environment quite dictates how people behave. So if the environment is created that allows people to do the right thing, the tendency for all of us as social animals is that we want to do the right thing because it's good for the general environment. So it is the leaders. Look at how our leaders drive. I mean, if you see an African president, Chinua Achebe talks about it in his book, The Trouble with Nigeria. that when an African president is moving, it is theater and drama at once. Complete with dancers and witch doctors. And he says that there is no security value at all in the movement of an African leader. It is for his or her ego. And because the indiscipline starts at the top, we also think that indiscipline is a good thing. So when you have become a big man, when you are appointed as a parastatal head and you go to the airport in Harare, you now think you ought not to queue. And even the workers think you ought not to queue. They come and tell you, sir, I've made my point.
Thank you very much. Another question? Over there.
As he's waiting for the question, even at conferences such as this, there are those gadgets. There are some of us in the room who think they should take them away. To give them as toys to the children. But that's
okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You made a comparison with African countries to say that they've got debt and therefore, future generations are going to inherit debt, and we're able to relate it to the way the economies are run and the corruption. Now, I also want you just to compare the same problem and maybe the nature of the corruption with the United States, why the debt is 107% of GDP, 21 trillion, and therefore future generations in the United States are inheriting $70,000 per head as debt, compared to the Zimbabwean situation as well. How different is that debt problem arising, and is it because of the nature of the corruption? And if so, how different is it from the African context?
Thank you. Without the advantage of being an economist, to take my answer with a pinch of salt, because what I'm doing is simply to answer it from my perspective as somebody who is curious about these things. And I was looking, and you've talked about the United States, and those of you who are bankers will be familiar with the concept of gearing ratio. We are talking about the largest economy in the world with a GDP of possibly 14 trillion United States dollars. We are talking about an economy whose institutions are run generally efficiently. We are talking about a country whose resources are also generally managed efficiently. We are talking about an economy whose external investments are generally at a very high level, so that if you were to say that the United States of America was a country and you are to liquidate it, you would possibly look at the debts and the liabilities and they would possibly balance off. The economists in this arena would be the best to respond to that. So, but I'm looking at a country, and I'll give the example of a country such as yours, or a country like Burundi. If you look at the debt situation of many African countries, you would discover that the manner in which they are run is that essentially they are mortgaged without collaterals that are worth their value, other than in their fictional value. We talk about, for example, that the Democratic Republic of Congo is the country that is the wealthiest in terms of natural resources if they are exploited. But we never ask the fundamental question, who will exploit? Because in order to exploit and generate power in Inga, you need technology. Do we have the technology? In order to develop or to use the timber in the equatorial forest, do we have the technology? to take uranium? Do we have the technology? In other words, the wealth that we have is so basic and so raw that if it was not actually exploited by using external capacity, it counts for nothing. It is gold unmined. It is flowers ungathered. And I'm suggesting, therefore, without once again being an expert in this area, that we are not comparing like with like. We are looking at a country whose institutions are fundamentally intact. And if you looked at the report yesterday that was given by the Treasury by the government of the United States, you can see that the fundamentals are in the right place. But look at our country here. The fundamentals are not in place. The fundamentals are not in place. That is why even in the areas where we thrive, like agriculture, we have got to enter into what one may call emergency mode in order to have command situation, in the hope that through that intervention we'll revert back to the original position as we were possibly 20 years ago. We are not talking about the like situation. To talk about, let me give you the example. It is like a patient who is in ICU, and you describe the patient as critical but stable. To the doctor, that makes sense. To the relative who cannot see the patient responding at all, says, what are you saying? Critical but stable, but he cannot even speak to me. That is one case. The other one is a patient with a cold and is coughing, and the cough is reducing. So the United States of America may have a cold, but our countries are in ICU, critical but stable.
Thank you very much. Okay, by public demand, we can only take one more question.
All right, hello. Professor, thank you very much for the presentation. But my question is, I look at it this way, the generational issues. From the 70s, perhaps to 60s to 70s, there were different generational challenges. For the people of Africa, it was probably acquiring education. So for most of the people in this room, our fathers spent their time educating themselves so we could be educated. Then we talk about this issue about value addition. A lot of the goods that the first world is making money out of have come out of Africa. Are we standing up to the challenge of our time if we also keep doing the same thing? Take out the materials as they are, like you said, without evaluating them and deciding them out. What would you say is the challenge of this particular generation in terms of developing Africa?
You know, there are two books that I've read which I commend to all of us in terms of dealing with the African question. They are both by Martin Meredith, The State of Africa and The Fortunes of Africa. And one of the things when I look at Africa during the 1960s, look at Nigeria, for example. If you went to Nigeria in those days, the textile factories in Kaduna were working. They were producing, they were satisfying themselves with textile produce. If you went to the universities such as the University of Furabe in Freetown in Sierra Leone, they were producing graduates who had practical skill. You came to my own country, Kenya, there was the Egerton University of Agriculture. They produced diploma graduates who were hands-on. And I'm sure that even in this country, you can, in Ghana, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and you had things thriving, whether it was the textile industry, whether it was in food production. And in those early days, those of you who are economists will remember that African economies were growing anything between 7 and 9%, and indices in all areas of human development were actually growing, whether it was infant mortality, maternal mortality, whether it was literacy and numeracy. In all those areas, you could see entire populations being moved out. At one time, even in your own country, you had the highest numeracy literacy in Africa, at nearly 90% in the 1980s. Something was happening. Then, and Professor Lovemore said it, what he called the 6 Ds. I think there is a sense where we missed the boat. We rested so much on our laurel and celebrated those early, very rudimentary developments, and we forgot that the world had changed over. The net effect, therefore, is that we missed out. After fulfilling the very basic requirements, we did not adopt creatively some of these things. In the 1980s, during my own lifetime as a student, South Korea produced nothing. You will remember that. We were students at the university, some of us in 1980, when the South Korean students were in the streets. In Malaysia, in 1980, in China, in Tiananmen Square. Then in our own lifetime today, because they went into a different mode, and it was once again a function of leadership. A leadership that's saying that we cannot rest on our laurels. People talked about rain-fed agriculture. They said we can no longer rely on rain-fed agriculture. We must go into irrigation. We can no longer depend on primary products. We can no longer depend on all these things. We've got to move to the next level. And the Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese were sent in their droves to Europe and America, and they came back and started this idea of reverse engineering, demolishing radios and producing some. Today, in our rooms, if there is no TV, which is LG, it is Panasonic, is Samsung, if there is, all of us have phones here, we either have Techno or we have all these phones because of leadership. And I want to submit, as I conclude that limb of my answer, is that there is a sense in which at a certain stage in Africa, we lost the script. So that when we were being asked, in the area of education, what have you done? Says we used to have 600 primary schools. We have 6,000 primary schools. How many dispensaries do you have? We used to have 600, we now have 1,000. But if you went into those buildings, concrete, they were just building. We thought that concrete is a hospital. We thought that classroom is what education is all about. Universities, we had one university at independence. We now have 10 universities, but what are we teaching at those universities? They are examination administering factories where certificates are issued, where they are using technology that stopped being used 20 years ago to teach engineering. The net effect, we now have semi-illiterate graduates who cannot produce. And the good professor said it, nobody commit. People ask, what is research that you are talking about? They are not interested in research. And I think, therefore, going forward, is that we must go back to the basics. We must go back to the basics and ask ourselves, what kind of education? If you go to countries where serious things are being done, and I'm suggesting that we are not doing serious things. That is what I'm suggesting. You go to countries where serious things are done. Has it never been lost on you that in my country and in many African countries, if you are sick, God forbid it, you survive in spite of the doctor's intervention, in spite of. And if you have a little money in this country, I'm sure you go to South Africa. In Kenya, we go to India. We have now imported Cuban doctors into Kenya. But we have professors of medicine. In other words, in both our guarded and unguarded moments, even we now don't believe in ourselves. So I think that self-esteem, and I'm going to talk about this as my last point. Even here, I saw the advert by Deloitte, which I respect, which is one of the big four. Deloitte, Price Waterhouse, Ernst & Young, KPMG. Where is Ndlovu and Ndlovu? And that to me is a legitimate question. Even our own governments, when they want to do serious work, they say, Deloitte, Ernst & Young. If you are Ndlovu, unless you are working, if you are Ndlovu, you must work under Deloitte. Then they will respect you. If you form your own outfit, work dwindles. Why? Because Deloitte and the KPMGs and the Ernst & Youngs and Price Waterhouse houses have demonstrated, I'm not saying they are perfect, but they have demonstrated consistently over time, because I don't think the man called Deloitte is alive, is he? No. If he was a person, that is. I don't think Ernst & Young are alive. But they built an institution with certain traditions, with certain things, and that is what people keep on selling. That is what people keep on buying. But our Ndlovus, when you open your accounting firm and you are given a fee of 1 million, the check does not leave your inner pocket or your pillow because you want to be in control. So the net effect is that in many African countries, we like to own 100% of a rabbit instead of owning 10% of an elephant, which is much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. We have room for one last question, and so the lady has a question. That will be the last question for Professor.
My name is Chieta. Professor, you spoke of national vision, the importance of having a vision that goes beyond political terms, and that in most African countries, our visions are really limited to political terms. And you also spoke of colonization and how it has also affected us as an African people of our identity and who we are. And as we're on this journey where we have the leadership crisis and we need to raise servant leaders who put the community first as opposed to themselves, how important do you think our culture, our knowledge of our heritage, and the knowledge of our land as Africans, the knowledge of where we came from and who we really are, is important in us to build authentic leaders who are stewards of the land and who are proud and who are also patriotic. Most of the countries you also gave examples of who've done well are also very great in terms of patriotism, and that also sort of helps in following a national vision or the nation even buying it. So do we need to incorporate that in our education system so that we understand who we are as a starting point and then we're able to actually follow a national vision? Thank you.
I'm inviting you to read a book that is written by a professor of political science and also a cultural leader. The book's title is Culture and Development, the Paradigm of Ghana by Nana Kobitia V. I'll give you the full title because I think all of us should read it. This is an individual who has had the advantage of formal education at a university which is informed by the logic of the Western world, and also happens to be a traditional ruler amongst the Ashanti people. And he poses the fundamental question. And it's the question that at one time had been posed to me by a friend of mine who was a Swedish individual. I asked him, why is it that you are so few? There are no more than 1,000 Swedes in Kenya, but you have a Swedish school. There is a Norwegian school in Kenya. And when you go to outside countries, there is an Italian cultural center, British cultural center, and American cultural center. And he told me, history has demonstrated times without number that in real terms, real and sustainable development can never be attained through the language of another people. And he told me, look at Sweden. We instruct our young people in Swedish. Look at Finland, we instruct our young people in Finnish. Look at Norway, we instruct our young people in Norwegian. Look at any country, we instruct our young people in our language. They meet other languages, but the foundational language is their language. And he told me that culture does not mean culture that is frozen in time, because the assumption in many African countries, when you ask Africans to wear their cultural attire, we normally come with animal skins. But that every civilization was wearing. We are stuck at animal skins. Yet we have leather tanning and all these, and silk. If you go to Europe, they used to wear leather skins. Why are we still wearing leather skin? Those are museum artifacts. Because factories have come, and what used to be leather is what we now have as shoes. Crocodile skins for shoes. And I'm suggesting to us that there is a place for culture. I believe that there is a place for culture. Is there any modern country that has done it? In my view, there are quite a number. I want you to read the history of Switzerland, which was at war for almost 100 years, which was actually tribal war amongst the Italian-speaking peoples, the German-speaking peoples, the Italian-speaking peoples, and the French-speaking peoples. Then some leader came and said, we are living in a single country called Sweden, and we are going to live here in our diversity and create a country that functions. And they did. And you go to the 12, or is it now more cantons of Switzerland, where there is a German population, they are instructing their children in German. Where there is an Italian population, they are doing so. Whether there is a French population, they are doing so. The government in Bern only coordinates foreign affairs and general policies and, of course, defense. You go to Spain, where there are 17 regions. You go to an area such as the Catalan. There are things that they are doing like the Catalan. Go to the Basque country. They even teach in their own language. So I think that there is a merit in Africans beginning to examine this. And I think the South Africans have been very forthright in this, and I like it. They said, we have 11 national languages. And if they can work on it, there is a sense in which you then enjoy the value and the fruits of unity in diversity. And, of course, in this country, I know that you have several languages, and I know friends who used to be here, and I was very happy that they were being taught in Shona or in Ndebele, because in that way you build the foundation. Then we can interact with English at a different level, because English no longer belongs to the English. They don't even speak it well. We long appropriated English, and we can now use it, because whether you like it or not, English is now a language of commerce, whether you like it or not. But we do so upon a foundation. We look at some of our cultural practices. Once again, post-genocide Rwanda, what they did in order to resolve their problems was to revert to what are traditional justice systems called gacaca. If you go now in the area of poverty, the government has decided that in order to lift people from poverty, they are giving each household a cow. And it has said a number of things have improved. Nutrition has improved. Public health has improved. Maternal mortality indices have improved. Infant mortality indices are improved. And it is the good professor who said once again, I don't think it's the professor, but somebody else said, the most dangerous human being is a human being who is hungry. And if you want to know how dangerous such an individual is, ask Jesus Christ. How? Whenever he had given them spiritual food, he would ask, have they eaten? Have they eaten? And having been told that they had not eaten, that is the basis on which he turned fish and bread into food. And if you doubt me that that was a solitary affair, you ask God himself. When he had removed the Israelites from Egypt, what did he do? He gave them manna. So the most important thing, feed the people, and then the people will begin to think. And as I conclude, you know, somebody put it a lot more better than I would, that the greatest security is food security. Once you've fed your people, then you can ask them to think about nanotechnology. Even you who is a scientist, you ask somebody to talk about nanotechnology when you have not eaten for 2 days. At that time, what you want is nishima. The pap is what you want, because that is foundational. So in a nutshell, I'm saying, and this is where the universities, those who are academics, have failed Africa. They have failed Africa because their governments have failed them. African governments, if you look at many African countries today, the leading anthropologists, if you go to the Shona people, the leading anthropologist in Shona is not a Shona. He's an English person sitting somewhere at the University of London. The leading anthropologist on Zulu and Ndebele is not a Zulu. Because for some reason, the Caucasians, whether you like it or not, long discovered that knowledge is the difference between civilizations. Those who know are the ones who govern the world. You can now see the Chinese banned women and men from having more than 2 children. 2 years ago, they said they can now have the second child. Why? Because the second child has an economic value. In expanding China, you will need labor. You are slowly moving into Africa. The second child is the child who will be working with us here in 20 years. Look, I want you to very keenly observe the second Chinese child. The second Chinese child will be here. And when he is here, as I said in jest and as I conclude, time is coming where when we go to baptismal naming and you are asked, and which name do you give this child? You'll say Deng Xiaoping and Love.
Thank you very much. I think I speak for a lot more people that the professor is leaving us with so much excitement in our hearts, for a lot of knowledge. We're burning with excitement. Thank you very much. I would like to call Faithful Taruvinga to provide a token of appreciation to the professor. And we'll also, in the same manner, I would also like to call the Presidium and Match Society to take a pic with the prof on stage. Also, please note that the professor has also provided us with the presentation, which was not plugged anyway, but it's all here, and we also have a hard copy. So we will circulate the presentation afterwards. Plus yes, we will circulate all the presentations. We'd also like to call Mr. Nyajeka to also come and get his token of appreciation.
Thank you very much. That was a tantalizing presentation. Thank you.
The MESH organizing committee, please could you also come up? before you get off the stage, please could we also have Professor Mbiki to also come and take a picture on the stage with the Presidium. Ladies and gentlemen, please note that we have another session, another short session that's coming through. So before you leave, can we just wait for an extra maybe 20 minutes? I would like to introduce the last session for this morning session, for this second half of the session, which is going to be about lifestyle management. This will be presented by Dr. Austin Jeans. His biography is as follows. Dr. Austin Jeans is a specialist sports and exercise medicine physician in Harare, Zimbabwe, where he has practiced medicine for 30 years. He graduated in medicine from the UZ Medical School in Harare, and after initially pursuing a medical career in the military and emergency medicine, completed a postgraduate degree in sports medicine at the University of Cape Town. He is the medical director of the Rove Valley Sports Medicine Center, the Innovative High Performance Center, and the Low Carb Lifestyle Program. He has been Zimbabwe's chief medical officer to 4 Olympic teams, 3 Africa Game teams, national cricket, judo, triathlon, and hockey teams, and consults for several national sports associations. He is the current chair of the Zimbabwe Rugby Union Medical Committee. He is a member of the Zimbabwe Olympic Committee's Medical Commission and sits on the World Rugby Development Nations Medical Subcommittee. He was invited to be part of the International Olympic Committee's Medical Commission Presenters Panel at the 2016 IOC Advanced Team Physicians course. He published a book, The Low Carb Companion, in 2016 on lower carb healthy fat nutrition for weight loss, diabetes, and sports nutrition, and the US edition was published in early 2018. He is an active age group athlete in triathlon, swimming, and eco-adventure racing. Please help me welcome Dr. Jeans.
Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize for the gravelly voice. I feel a bit of a fraud and maybe a little bit corrupt in terms of the last meeting, because I am the Chiremba and I'm the one who appears to be ill today. I also don't want to be one of those semi-illiterate graduates that the professor was talking about. I lecture at many medical conferences, and I have to say, to my memory, I don't ever remember having an accountant address a medical conference. So actually this is a great privilege that you have a medical person addressing an accounting conference. So I hope this is worthwhile. A big thank you to the Institute for the invitation. I think you've had a fantastic program these last couple of days, and certainly I think we'd all agree that the Chobe experience yesterday was absolutely fantastic. Mr. Jonas Moshosho, when he spoke on the first day, talked about future risk thinking. And it was interesting because it resonated with me that a lot of what I'm going to say this afternoon is also about future risk thinking when it comes to personal health, which impacts dramatically on public health. Which way am I pushing this thing? That way. Conflicts of interest. We're always taught in medical conferences to announce conflicts of interest. So in the introduction, it was very kindly mentioned that I did publish a book in 2016 and 2018 in the USA, mainly because I believe that people need to read. The last speaker mentioned many books, and that's how we learn. We read. And I realize that people in this country need a resource of information to digest what I'm about to say and take it forward in their own lives. So those of you who want to have a look at this book sometime, they are available in Zimbabwe. We're actually going to give away 2 at the end of the presentation, so hopefully that disincentivizes you from leaving before the end. So the emphasis, although I want to talk about healthy lifestyles, what you may have gathered from the fact that I've written a book on this is that the real emphasis is on nutrition. And I'll tell you why. This is the problem that we have. If you believe in evolution, which most of us in the medical and scientific world do, humans have been around on the planet for about 2.5 million years. And in the last 40 years, something has changed. Humans are changing. And they're looking a little bit more like that. So in medicine, and certainly in lifestyle medicine, which impacts dramatically on public health, this is the problem that we are dealing with at the current moment in time. What about the relevance to you sitting here in the auditorium? Well, I'm going to ask all of you to stand up just for a few seconds. If you can all just stand up. I want you to look down. I want you to look down, and I want you to see if this mutumbu of yours is obscuring a clear view of your feet. And if that is true, I want you to sit down. I want you to sit down. If your mutumbu is obscuring your feet, I want you to sit down. There's not enough of you sitting down. If any of you suffer from high blood pressure, or you know someone in your family who has high blood pressure, I want you to sit down. If any of you have type 2 diabetes, or you have someone in your family with type 2 diabetes, I want you to sit down. And if you have children about whose future you care about, I want you to sit down. That has not... Right. So the point I'm trying to make is that most of what I'm going to tell you is relevant to just about everyone in the auditorium. So some of you are looking at me a little bit like that, and I'm also looking at you in the same way. And where you're going to go next, psychologically, as the Americans say, you're going to enter the state of denial. So from a conceptual point of view, when we talk about lifestyle medicine and health and wellness as a construct, for years we have worked on a model that has 4 pillars: exercise, nutrition, sleep, and happiness. But if you're a structural engineer, there's a problem with this conceptual model as far as the structure is concerned. And that problem is that it lacks a foundation. And no structure without a foundation will stand up very strongly. So we've realized that actually this health and wellness construct is actually wrong. And we've now reformatted that. And we now realize that in fact nutrition is the foundation of health and wellness. And that exercise, sleep, and happiness or lack of stress are extremely important. But none of them are as important as nutrition. I think they put this talk in just before lunch to ruin your lunch as well. I'm going to give you the takeaway messages from this talk at the beginning. You've had a long morning, so I'm going to give them to you now so that if you lose concentration after this, you at least know what I want you to take away. The first one, and accountants love counting things. I think accountants invented the calories model of weight gain. So we've worked on this model for 40 years, that you gain weight because you take in more calories than you expend, which leaves you with a net surplus of energy, and therefore you gain weight. Well, we've realized that that itself is also wrong. Calories don't count, and we shouldn't be counting calories. And you might find that surprising. If calories don't count, then what the hell does? And the answer is metabolism counts. And abnormal metabolism causes abnormal health, which I will show you. I'm going to show you that there are 2 types of people in this room and on the whole planet. People who tolerate carbohydrate foods and people who don't. I'm going to tell you that the fourth point to take away is that diets don't work. And in fact, the low-fat diet, which is the most predominant form of dieting in the modern world, should have been phased out in 2015 when all the research said that all of the low-fat diets had done was help the world become a fatter and sicker planet. And those of you who remember this lady at the Botswana border yesterday, who was making us all put our foot in her mouth, which is what I understood, I'm sure she's dieted many, many times, and she hasn't got anywhere. I didn't ask her permission for that, so I'm probably in trouble. The fifth takeaway point is the role of exercise. And for most people, they feel that exercise is a way to work off the mathematical construct of what they have just eaten. So you'll have to run 6 Ks to work off your French fries and nearly 2 Ks to work off your soft drink. Well, that's not true. Exercise is a celebration of what you can do. It's not a punishment for what you ate. The sixth takeaway point, which I'm really going to emphasize this afternoon, is that sugar is probably the most noxious foodstuff on earth and is largely responsible for most of the public health problems that we deal with across the world. I'm going to show you that some of you this morning ate more than 20 teaspoons of sugar at breakfast alone, and that most of your children consume more than 20 teaspoons of sugar before they go to school in the morning. And the final point is that the diseases of lifestyle, what we now understand, pretty much all have a common cause. And the diseases of lifestyle that we talk about are diabetes, which leads to Alzheimer's, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, cancer. All of these are related to a metabolic condition called insulin resistance, which I'm going to show you. And all of these are related to the amount of dietary sugar that enters your body on a daily basis. And you're all looking at me like that, which is good. This story starts way back in 1980. In 1980, the Americans, who for some reason the rest of the world chooses to follow for reasons I still don't understand, they changed the World Food Guidelines and told us that because the Americans had an epidemic of heart disease, the entire world should change the way that they eat, and 60% of the calories, instead of 40%, which was true before 1980, should come from the base of this pyramid, which are predominantly carbohydrate foods. We were told to cut fats from our diet and eat all these carbs, and industry thereafter made it their profit model to make carbohydrates very cheap, very easy to access, very easy to eat. And if you look at the graph of sugar intake just in the last 50 years, which is the right-hand side of that particular graph, it's an exponential increase of more than 20 times what our great-great-grandparents were consuming in the early 19th century. If you look at protein and fat, you'll notice that we don't eat much more of those. And in fact, worldwide, we're all listening to the guidelines that the Americans invented, and most countries in the world eat about 11% less fat than they did before 1980. So we certainly can't blame the epidemic of diseases of lifestyle on fat intake. If you look at this graph, which is quite interesting, there's 1980, independence for Zimbabwe, and also the American guideline change with food. You can see an immediate impact on obesity rates in the USA, and that is true around the world. If you look at the tail end of that graph, you'll notice that the estimate is by 2030, more than half of the American population will be overweight or obese, and they're not far away from there at this point. We know that there's a close relationship between carbohydrate and sugar intake and weight gain. It's about 14 or 15 years after you see countries increase their obesity rates that you see their diabetes rates climb dramatically. And in 1994, in the USA, 14 years after they introduced the guidelines, you see the first blip upwards in their diabetes rates, and they have continuously climbed from that point onwards. So just a couple of words on carbohydrates, because I've used the word carbs and carbohydrates. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the fiber in vegetables, we're talking about the starch in our sadza, and we're talking about sugary foods. And this is sort of the nature of modern food. Some of it's organic, but more and more of it is processed. And that's really going to be the problem, and is the problem. If we go into supermarket shelves, we don't see much in the way of organic food anymore. We see everything in boxes and bottles and cans and packets. And what might interest you is that we know that sugar is added to about 80% of processed food. So even if that food is a carbohydrate food, 80% of those foods, the industry will add sugar to that because it makes it taste nice, and then you want to go and get some more. So in Raisin Bran, which is construed by most as a healthy cereal, there are 5 teaspoons of sugar added to a 30-gram serving. 30-gram serving is not very much, so I'm sure most of you have double that, and probably had double that this morning. Cocoa Puffs have 3 teaspoons of sugar per serving. Right, any of the accountants in the front row, could they tell me how many teaspoons of sugar in a Coca-Cola can? It sounds like an auction for a goat or a cow. Well, you haven't gone high enough. We need double figures. There are 10 teaspoons of sugar in a single Coca-Cola, and I will give that figure relevance in a minute. So what people do when they kind of figure that out, they say, okay, well, let's feed our children healthy fruit juice. We'll kind of talk them out of too many Coca-Colas and soft drinks. So let's give them some healthy Minute Maid orange juice. Well, there are 12 teaspoons of sugar in a bottle of Minute Maid, and I don't know why anyone finds that surprising, because the manufacturer of Minute Maid is Coca-Cola. Minute Maid is a product of the Coca-Cola company. This is what modern food looks like. It doesn't look anything like what comes out of the ground or walks the pastures of our livestock agricultural industry. And in fact, if you like Starbucks, thank the Lord we don't have Starbucks yet. Starbucks quite recently brought out a Frappuccino which changed color as you drank it, which everybody found quite novel and queued up for kilometers in the USA when it was launched. And for the pleasure of drinking this Frappuccino that changed color while you drank it, you actually consumed 17 teaspoons of sugar in that particular cup. So, a little bit of biology, quite tough for accountants. This is when you become the semi-illiterate graduates, but I'm going to improve your level of literacy. When we eat carbohydrates, in whatever form they are, we digest them simply to sugar. And those sugars are usually glucose or fructose or both. And the same when we put sugar into our tea or coffee, or the Americans who are always looking for a cheaper alternative, they use high fructose corn syrup in the soft drinks. It doesn't really matter. Once we digest sugar, it becomes glucose or fructose, or glucose and fructose. And when this glucose gets into our blood, it basically creates nice big spikes if we've had some cereals, as you can see in the red graph. And if we were to have an egg, you wouldn't see anything like that impact on the level of sugar in our blood. Now, why is that important? So when we digest these carbohydrates, these carbs to glucose, the first place you're going to find it is in the blood. But we can't wander around with a huge spike in blood sugar all day and tomorrow, because if you do, then you have a disease called diabetes. Therefore, we have systems to regulate the amount of sugar in our blood, and we can push that sugar into our livers, and we can push it into our muscles, thereby reducing the level of glucose in the blood. And that's how we maintain a normal state of blood sugar in the human body. However, if we are unable to store the amount of sugar coming in our livers and our muscles, we have a default position, and that is we can store it in our fat stores. And we have a lovely chugubu on the front of the body, which can store an enormous amount of fat from the conversion of sugar. It's a very effective and expandable chugubu for fat deposition. And I want to point out, this is fat that is coming from sugar. This is not fat coming from the intake of fat. Those chugubus are filled by sugar converted to fat, not by fat coming into your body. How is this regulated? Well, the master conductor of hormones when it comes to food is something called insulin, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And when we eat frequently in the day, which most of us do because we're those dangerous people that the professor was talking about, we're always hungry, our blood sugar is going up and down, and so our insulin is going up and down in concert so that we respond to that level of glucose in the blood. So insulin controls the fate of sugar in the body, and insulin drives that sugar from the blood to the liver, from the blood to the muscles. And anything left over, insulin says, convert it to fat and store it in that lovely abdominal chugubo. Insulin is a storage hormone. That's its job in the body. I'm going to talk about people who are intolerant to carbohydrates. Intolerance not in the terms of allergy, but in terms of the fact there are many people who wander the earth who don't tolerate carbohydrates at any given amount very well. If people who don't handle carbohydrates very well eat a high carbohydrate food intake, effectively they have much larger amounts of insulin in their body. And after a couple of years, their livers and their muscles stop listening to insulin, and we call that insulin resistance. And if you can't take the sugar out of your blood and store it in your liver and your muscles, you only have one default position. You must convert it to fat. And therefore the body fat stores will get bigger and bigger over time, and that chugubo will expand. So, what have we just learnt about having high insulin in the body? Well, sugar will be converted to fat, and it will be stored there. But interestingly, insulin has another nefarious effect on the body. It actually locks up our fat stores. So this is very similar to the chugubo that most of us have at home, where you don't get municipal water in Harare, where I live. And you have a chugubo where you can fill it from the top, and most of us have a tap on the bottom so we can get the water out. But this particular chugubo has no tap, or the tap is locked. So we can fill it continuously, and it can expand. But we can't get this fat out. Hence the weight will gain. This is an interesting looking picture. This is a man with breasts. No, it's not. This is a diabetic patient who has been injecting himself into his tummy wall for years. And what this picture displays is how effective insulin is at producing fat stores. These are fat stores in his abdominal wall, in his tummy, from simply injecting insulin into that site for years and years and years. This is how powerful insulin is at creating the storage of fat. The professor talked about hungry people. When we eat a lot of carbohydrates, and the more refined those carbohydrates, we use up the very low energy density in carbs very quickly. And carbohydrates, and especially sugar, go straight to the brain, and they push buttons in the brain which are pretty much like an addiction, and they create hunger. Continuous or 2-hourly hunger. So, what I'm saying to you is that getting fatter is not a calorie disorder. It's got nothing to do with energy surplus. It's a metabolic disorder. When we have lots of sugar, we have lots of insulin, and we gain lots of weight. The nutrients that pump up insulin in the body are sugar and refined carbohydrates in the main, unrefined carbs to an extent, to a very small extent protein, and fat doesn't affect insulin at all. So in simple biological terms, fat can't make you fat. Fat cannot make you fat. Fat does not provoke insulin, and if you don't provoke insulin in the human body, you can't store fat. So bang goes this ridiculous theory that we've all carried around for years, and which nutritionists expound day in and day out. It has no biological plausibility. So getting fatter is metabolic, and when you have excessive carbohydrates, you have high blood sugars, they convert it to fat, and you store that fat. And when this goes on for years and years and years, you develop more and more of that insulin resistance, so the liver and the muscles are not taking up any more sugar. Your sugars are high in the blood, your insulin is high, and we just store that fat all over the body, and especially in the abdominal area. And if you go 10, 15 years, then you start to see obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, what we call the diseases of lifestyle. So what about these two types of people? Well, metabolically speaking, as I mentioned, some people tolerate carbs very well, and they eat lots of carbs and they stay skinny, and their health remains good. They're lucky, because 65 to 75% of people in any population, once they get to a certain level of carbohydrates, sugar, and refinement, are going to show more and more of this insulin resistance, and their tummy is going to look a lot more like the gentleman on the left. So the message here is, as the sugar stacks up, the waistline expands. So what about that challenge that I issued, that some of you would have consumed more than 20 teaspoons of sugar, and your kids probably do that in the mornings? Well, there's the breakfast. It's got some cereal, it's got some bread, it's got some Nutella, and it's got some orange juice, and some things that are going to go into the bowl. So what's going to go into the bowl is some flavored yogurt and a ripe banana. And I've put the numbers there because I know accountants are quite good with those things. And if you add up all those numbers, which are the teaspoons of sugar in each of those foodstuffs, you get to 24 teaspoons of sugar. So I call this breakfast 24. And I know when I lecture parents at schools in Harare that many parents at this slide are holding their heads in their hands because that's what their children are eating before they go to school. That's healthy. It's got yogurt. It's got cereal. But it's got sugar, and a lot of it. We know that what women eat in pregnancy determines the metabolism of their babies. In America, we have obesity in 6-year-olds. And you have to ask a question. A 6-year-old has not been alive 10 or 15 years. So how does a 6-year-old become morbidly obese? And the answer is, his or her metabolism has been influenced while they were still in the uterus by what mummy is eating and what mummy's insulin levels are, which is a scary thought. And then, when we give up breastfeeding, we feed our kids these infant feeding formulas. Now, in breast milk, you have about 24% of breast milk is carbohydrates. So God knows where industry decided that infant feeding formulas should be 60% sugar. And these kids, you can tell all the kids who are on infant feeding formulas, everyone says they're cute. Well, I say they're fat. And we know that when they're toddling, it's very easy to feed our kids junk. In fact, in the States, they reckon that 40% of a child's carbohydrate intake in the States is junk food. And look at that Coca-Cola can. It's almost bigger than the child. And there are 10 teaspoons of sugar entering his system. So kids are drowning in this processed, refined carbohydrate food of the modern era. They get more of their nutrition advice from Ronald McDonald than from anyone who's qualified to talk about healthy, comprehensive nutrition. And we see the problems in kids. We see them starting early. We see dental caries, holes in teeth literally dissolved by the amount of sugar that's coming in. We see fat kids, young age. We see ADHD kids. We see kids with bad skin, and we see kids with bad epilepsy, all consequential upon sugar intake. We see teenagers who consume the most soft drinks in the world. For some reason, teenagers and soft drinks seem to go together. And I make no excuses for the suicide vest with soft drinks in it. And then we see this transition from adulthood into the 30s and 40s, this transition from a healthy metabolic state to an unhealthy metabolic state, evidenced by the expanding chugubo on the front. So how much sugar is too much? Well, thank the Lord, in 2015, the World Health Organization actually made a very strong statement. And their statement was that more than 6 teaspoons of sugar a day for an adult is too much. And that more than 3 teaspoons of sugar a day for children is too much. How much was in a Coca-Cola? So if a child drinks a Coca-Cola, they're drinking more than 3 times what the WHO recommends in sugar intake, which is particularly concerning. So, if we want health and wellness, we have to put nutrition at the foundation of this particular model. How do we do that? If we want to be healthy, we need to cut out most of the refined carbohydrates and the bulk of easily obtained sugar. We need to eat fibrous vegetables and less sugary fruits. We need to eat healthy fats, most of which will come with nature's protein. These are organic foods. We need to cut out unhealthy fats. So there are some unhealthy fats, and unfortunately these are the cheap polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which are highly inflammatory and produce a lot of toxic chemicals when we use them for cooking and frying. If we reduce refined carbohydrates and sugar, we restore a healthy metabolic state because we reduce insulin resistance and we restore healthy weight in people who struggle with that. We know that this poor individual who's trying to run off his calorie model fails 98% of the time. If you look at weight loss over 2 years with exercise, it's a 98% failure rate. That might depress some of you. And I have a mantra, and that is you cannot outrun a bad diet. As important as exercise is, you cannot outrun a bad diet. And just a few other things about medical nutrition and health. When you eat less carbohydrate and more healthy fat, hearts are in much better condition. Blood pressure goes down. Diabetes, if you look at the yellow line on that curve, that is the improvement in blood sugar on a low carbohydrate diet compared to a vegetarian diet or the American Diabetic Association diet. And I can tell you that in our clinic we reverse diabetes type 2 in 90% of cases within 6 to 12 months. When I went to medical school, I was taught that diabetes is a chronic condition that will require doctors and medication for life. That was not true. We have redefined a balanced diet as one that normalizes blood sugar and prevents that high insulin. I like this one. Just keep calm and eat real food. That's the message. Real food, not what comes in boxes, packets, tins. This is the only way we're going to reverse this deleterious state of human progress in the last 40 years since the World Food Guidelines were changed. Healthy eating results in healthy people, and when there's enough of them, we have a healthy nation. Some of you are still looking like that. Thank you very much. Show you. Right, I want you to have a look under your chair. And if under your chair is one of my business cards, you're going to come up and get one of these books. Is that one? No, that's not one. And if it's not under your chair and there's an empty chair next to you, look under that chair. Normally put them under some chairs, but I don't know where she put them. Okay, well that's a mystery, because we certainly put them under some chairs. All right, so we'll have another mechanism since we haven't found them. I'm very happy to take any questions. Are there any questions? Can I ask you to use the microphone because the acoustics are not particularly good? And can you go and deliver the book to her because she asked a good question?
As I was saying, I have a question about the new fad. It's called the keto way of eating. I think it focuses on high fat. What are your thoughts? Good or bad?
All right. There's no such thing as good and bad. Keto eating simply refers to a very low carbohydrate intake, usually less than 30 grams a day, which if you want to some perspective on that, 30 grams is about a cup of strawberries. So keto way of eating is about restricting carbohydrate to very low levels, and we use that to treat diabetes, and we use it to treat morbid obesity. So where we're trying to reverse this metabolic state in individuals who are very significantly affected, then we cut their carbohydrates down to very, very low levels, and we encourage them to eat lots of healthy fat. And that is what keto eating is all about.
We'll take one last question.
Hello? Doctor, thank you. Is there a hormonal link to weight gain, particularly in the belly area, possibly linked to birth control, childbirth, and things like that?
Okay. When you store fat, and that's a 3-letter word, not a 4-letter word, in your tummy area, that's got absolutely nothing to do with hormones or pills or anything. It's got everything to do with abnormal metabolism, which I talked about. When you store fat, as ladies, in your thighs and in your butts, that's got lots to do with hormones. And interestingly, when you store fat in your butt and your thighs, that is not an unhealthy area for fat storage. In fact, it's associated with fertility and with health. The problem is when that fat is in the tummy area. And again, I don't want to make it a long speech, but when fat is stored in the tummy area and the tummy is big, that is a very unhealthy type of fat that is stored there. It has deleterious impacts on a lot of the bodily processes and bodily hormones. It produces a lot of inflammatory chemicals in that tummy fat, which damage our hearts, they damage our arteries, and that's why they have so much to do with all these diseases of lifestyle, which I mentioned: diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure. These all become a consequence of that abdominal fat storage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Austin Jean. We'd like to ask Lorna Charamba to present a gift to the doctor. Thank you very much.
That's really good. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying.
Lorna Charamba?
She's gone for lunch.
She's coming.
I'm going to be watching you all in the restaurant at lunchtime. It's going to be quite interesting. Okay. I've been asked just about the book, and I did put up very quickly. The book is available in some of the bookshops in Harare and also in Bulawayo. If you want to know where, just give me a shout afterwards. I'm not here to sell books, but it is a resource of valuable information.
Thank you, everyone, for this morning session. I'm sure it was very filled with a lot of information. Just a few announcements, very important announcements. We will break for lunch at this very moment. Lunch will be there until 2:30. At 2:30, there's going to be there's going to be sports sessions. There will be tennis, there will be volleyball, and there will be netball. The golf sessions are already happening right now as we speak. So what will happen is, for the guys who are staying outside of the Elephant Hills, there's already a shuttle available right now, so that you can go back to your hotels right now to go and pick up your sporting gears if they are still at the hotel, to pick up, and then the shuttle will then bring you back immediately because the lunch is here. The meal tickets will be available when you walk out of the door. You'll be given the meal tickets. After the sporting sessions, between 4:30 and 5, there will be shuttles. This is for the guys who are outside of Elephant Hills. There will be shuttles to take you back to your hotels in order for you to prepare for the black tie event, the dinner event that will start at 6 p.m. this evening. The dinner event will be held, I'm sure every time when we've been driving in, we've been noticing the big tent. The dinner event will be held in that particular tent because of our numbers. We're not able to find a venue within the hotel that will fit all of us. So the dinner event will be out there. Any questions? No, sorry? There will be heaters. And so thank you very much, everyone. I would also like to ask for all the presenters from Thursday and yesterday and even today, please could you come up also with the Presidium and the Mesh Committee to then come up and actually take pictures. We then decided to do it at the end so that everyone else can then be having lunch so that we can cut on time. But please do not go. Please could you come forward so that we can do the pictures right now as everyone else goes outside to have their lunch. Thank you very much.